The cold of the stone was the only mercy. It seeped through the thin linen of his shirt, a dull counterpoint to the fire in his shoulders. Niccolo Machiavelli hung from the rope, his wrists bound behind his back, the weight of his own body a precise and ingenious engine of agony. This was the strappado, the state's argument in its most eloquent form. With a jerk, they would drop him from the pulley, the sudden stop yanking his arms upward, threatening to tear the sockets from their moorings. They had done it 6 times. The cell in the Stinch prison was a world of shadows and the stench of fear, a place where men were reduced to their most animal core. Here was the final, perfect joke. The man who would dissect the anatomy of power with a scholar's calm was a broken puppet on a string. The diplomat who had parsed the intentions of kings and popes could not parse the intentions of his own screaming nerves. The architect of a citizen militia lay utterly defenseless. His career, his influence, his very identity as a servant of the Florentine Republic were ashes. The Medici, returned to power, had cast him into this black pit on suspicion of conspiracy. The irony was not lost on him, even in his delirium. It was a lesson more profound than any he had learned in the courts of Europe. In the lulls between the pain, his mind traitorously worked. It was his last possession. He could not stop observing, analyzing, translating the raw data of suffering into principle. As the jailer's footsteps echoed down the corridor, he considered the nature of the man's loyalty. Was it born of love for his masters? No. It was born of fear of this very room and the promise of reward for efficiency. This was the fundamental truth laid bare in the dungeon's gloom. Men are motivated by fear and self-interest. Love is a fickle currency. Control is a solid fact. He began composing not with quill and parchment, but in the dark theater of his skull. He addressed a prince, a young Lorenzo de' Medici, but he was writing for himself, a survival manual forged in despair. The treatise took shape against the backdrop of his own ruin. A prince must be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten the wolves. He, Niccolo, had been neither when it mattered. He had seen the trap too late and possessed no Leon power to counter it. A prince must cultivate the appearance of virtue, while being prepared to abandon it for the state's survival. The state. That abstract entity for which he had burned. Its preservation was the only morality that mattered in a world where popes waged war and republics crumbled overnight. His thoughts were a defiant act of alchemy, transmuting the lead of his humiliation into the cold, hard gold of theory. The prisoner, suspended in darkness, was giving birth to the prince. The world into which Niccolo was born in 1469 was a masterpiece of precarious balance. Florence, a republic in name, was in truth a delicate oligarchy sheathed in the velvet glove of Medici influence. His father, Bernardo, a lawyer of modest means and scholarly temperament, ensured the boy's education was steeped in the Latin classics. But the true curriculum was the city itself, an open-air lecture hall on power, spectacle, and human nature. From their modest house near the Ponte Vecchio, young Niccolo absorbed the rhythms of a state that was both a mercantile empire and a permanent theatrical production. Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, was the unseen principal of this school. He ruled not by title but by a network of patronage, strategic marriages, and sheer cultural brilliance. To the young observer, Lorenzo's power was a subtle, pervasive force, like the Arno's current, invisible from a distance, but shaping everything it touched. The city's vibrant chaos, its clashing factions of wealthy Automati and restless Popolo, its profane carnivals and pious processions, formed the chaotic data set upon which Niccolo's analytical mind began to operate. He learned that order was not a natural state but a crafted illusion maintained by a combination of consent, coin, and concealed force. The lesson turned violently explicit on a Sunday morning in April 1478, when Niccolo was 9. High Mass in the Duomo, the great cathedral swollen with the city's elite. The Pazzi conspiracy unfolded in a spasm of sacred space horror. From the crowd, Niccolò saw the daggers flash near the altar, heard the shouts, and witnessed the chaotic aftermath as Lorenzo, wounded, barricaded himself in the sacristy, while his brother Giuliano bled out on the marble floor. The conspiracy's failure was followed by a state-sanctioned fury more instructive than the attack itself. The swift, brutal executions were public theater of a different kind. Bodies dangled from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. Conspirators were hunted through the streets. Lorenzo emerged stronger, his vengeance uniting the populace in a shared shock and revulsion. Niccolo saw how violence, when applied decisively and displayed publicly, could consolidate power more effectively than years of careful diplomacy. The Republic's fragile legal veneer was stripped away, revealing the primal engine of fear beneath. The next master teacher arrived not with a dagger, but with a crucifix. Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery Dominican friar from Ferrara, began his ascent in the 1490s, his apocalyptic sermons, filling San Marco with citizens terrified of French invasions and divine wrath. As Lorenzo died and his son Piero proved inept, Savonarola's voice became the city's conscience. Niccolò, now a young man, watched with cold fascination as the friar replaced Medici pageantry with a new, terrifying spectacle, the bonfire of the vanities. In the Piazza della Signoria, piles of luxuries, fine dresses, paintings, mirrors, books deemed profane, were fed to the flames by penitent citizens. It was a revolution of piety, a demonstration of how deeply power could be rooted in the manipulation of collective guilt and heavenly terror. The fragile political order, Niccolo noted, could be shattered not just by swords, but by an idea, wielded by a man who understood the masses' longing for purity and their capacity for destructive fervor. By 1494, as the French army of Charles VIII descended into Italy and the Medici fled, Niccolo Machiavelli was 25. His formal education was complete, but his real schooling, conducted in the city's piazzas and prisons, had forged a singular mind. It was a mind that craved not just to understand the forces that moved men and states, but to grasp the levers itself. He hungered for a role in the affairs of the Republic that was now suddenly and terrifyingly without its guiding hand. The stage was cleared. The old drama was over. A new, more uncertain one was beginning, and he was determined to step out of the audience and into the action. The Medici fled Florence in November 1494, not with a bang but a whimper, scurrying from the wrath of a populace disillusioned by Piero's capitulation to the French king. The void they left was not one of silence, but of a cacophony of competing voices, all claiming to speak for the newly purified republic. From this chaos, one voice soon thundered above all others: Girolamo Savonarola's, the friar who had prophesied the invasion as God's scourge, now positioned himself as the city's spiritual and political architect. Niccolò Machiavelli, watching from the margins, witnessed the birth of a theocratic experiment, a masterclass in the uses and ultimate limits of ideological power. Savonarola's Florence became a city of stark contrasts. The vibrant, mercantile colors of the Renaissance were drowned in a sea of drab gray, the mandated garb of the penitent. The taverns and carnival masks vanished, replaced by solemn processions of hymn-singing children. The state was refounded on a covenant with God, its laws dictated by divine prophecy as channeled through the prior of San Marco. Niccolò observed the mechanics of this control with a clerk's dispassionate eye. The friar's power stemmed not from wealth or soldiers, but from a masterful manipulation of public emotion. He weaponized fear, fear of French lances, fear of hellfire, fear of worldly corruption, and offered himself as the sole conduit to salvation. And offered himself as the sole conduit to salvation. And offered himself as the sole conduit to salvation. Sole conduit himself is the sole conduit to salvation. His sermons were not mere homilies but strategic bulletins, identifying enemies, directing public sentiment, and consolidating his moral authority. It was a form of rule that fascinated Niccolò, for it demonstrated that power could flow as easily from the pulpit as from the palace, provided the speaker understood the hearts of the multitude. In this transformed city, Niccolò's long-held ambition found a narrow opening. In 1498, through family connections and his own demonstrated literacy and sharp mind, he secured a minor post as a clerk in the second chancery of the newly Republican government. The role was humble, involving the drafting of correspondence and administrative documents, but it placed him inside the machinery of state. His desk was a ringside seat to Savonarola's reign. He copied decrees that enforced moral laws, saw reports on the zealous weepers who policed their neighbors, and handled communications with a skeptical papal curia in Rome. He saw how ideology, when institutionalized, created its own bureaucracy, its own enforcers, and its own brittle reality. The Republic was no longer a balance of interests, but an instrument of a single, uncompromising vision. Yet from his vantage point, Niccolò also perceived the cracks spreading through the friar's holy edifice. Savonarola had made powerful enemies. The aristocratic Automatii resented his populist influence. The rival Franciscans envied his authority. Pope Alexander VI communicate him, but Pope Alexander VI, whom Savonarola denounced as a corrupt antichrist, was moving to excommunicate him. Most critically, the friar's power depended on a perpetual state of crisis and divine favor. When a proposed ordeal by fire to prove Savonarola's holiness fizzled in a rain-soaked farce in the Piazza della Signoria, the spell began to break. The crowd's fervor curdled into disillusionment. Niccolò noted the shift with clinical precision. The masses, he saw, were fickle. Their love, rooted in awe and fear, could evaporate overnight when the prophet's promises collided with a mundane reality of continued hardship and political isolation. The end came with a swiftness that was itself instructive. In May 1498, the very factions that had once tolerated or supported Savonarola, fearing papal interdict and economic ruin, turned on him. The Signoria authorized his arrest. He was tortured, tried for heresy and sedition, and condemned. Niccolò, from a respectful distance in the great piazza, watched the final spectacle. The friar and he, two of his loyal disciples, were hanged from a high cross, their bodies set ablaze. The ashes were scattered in the Arno to prevent any relic making. The crowd, once his devoted army, watched in a hushed, complicated silence before dispersing back to their daily lives. The lesson was seared into Niccolò's consciousness. Power based solely on ideology and charisma, without a foundation of material force and flexible alliances, was tragically ephemeral. A leader could command the souls of men, but still be betrayed by their self-interest and delivered to the executioner. The friar had understood the soul of Florence, but fatally misjudged its politics. As the smoke cleared over the silent piazza, Niccolò Machiavelli, the minor functionary, filed away the observation. It was a cornerstone of his developing thought. Visionary zeal alone was no match for the cold, enduring calculus of survival. The Chancery Post became a passport. For Niccolò Machiavelli, the ink-stained documents were not ends but means, conduits to the living, breathing world of statecraft he had studied from afar. By 1498, his sharp dispatches and clear mind earned him promotion to second chancellor and secretary to the Dieci di Libertà e Pace, the committee overseeing foreign and military affairs. The title was modest, but the role was a revelation. He was no longer an observer of Florence's drama, but an actor on the wider Italian stage, a stage drenched in the cold pragmatism of survival. His first major diplomatic mission in 1500 took him to the court of Louis XII of France. The journey across the Alps was a passage into a different political universe. The French court at Blois was a spectacle of calculated grandeur, but Machiavelli's focus pierced the gilt surface. King Louis, the self-styled father of the people, exhibited a dispassionate rationality that fascinated the Florentine envoy. Louis spoke of Italian affairs, the Duchy of Milan he had seized, the fractious states of the peninsula, not with passion or ideology, but with the detached analysis of a chess player. Alliances were weighed not by friendship or tradition, but by advantage. Promises were kept only as long as they served a tangible purpose. Machiavelli witnessed how the king's overwhelming military force, the ultima ratio of cold calculus. Florence, weak and militialess, was a supplicant here, its republican pleas for support assessed purely for their utility to French designs. The lesson was clear. In the councils of the powerful, sentiment was a weakness, and only strength commanded respect. He wrote detailed reports home, his prose meticulously outlining the brutal arithmetic of sovereignty he saw in operation. But it was his next assignment that would etch itself permanently into his intellectual framework. In late 1502, he was sent to the camp of Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois and son of Pope Alexander VI. Borgia was carving a personal kingdom out of the chaotic Romagna with a speed and ruthlessness that terrified Italy. Riding into the Duke's headquarters, Machiavelli entered a world of controlled terror. Borgia was a man of elegant dress and chilling calm, his authority emanating not from hereditary right, but from sheer, terrifying will. Machiavelli watched, horrified and mesmerized, as Borgia consolidated his gains. He saw the Duke lure his disloyal mercenary captains, the condottieri, to a meeting at Senigallia with promises of reconciliation. Once they were in his grasp, Borgia had them strangled. The act was not a fit of rage but a surgical strike, eliminating potential threats in one decisive, brutal move. Machiavelli spent months shadowing Borgia's court, a keen student of this new model of prince. He saw how Borgia used his papal father's authority when convenient, and his own ferocious energy when not. He observed the appointment of the ruthless Ramiro de Lorca to pacify the Romagna with violent justice. And then, when the man's cruelty had served its purpose and become a liability, Borgia had him executed in a public square, and become a liability. Borgia had him executed in a public square, placating the populace while dissociating himself from the bloodshed. It was a masterclass in the instrumental use of cruelty, applied swiftly, then blamed on a subordinate. Borgia's power was a stark, amoral engine, devoid of chivalric pretense or republican virtue. It was effective. It created order from chaos, and it worked. For Machiavelli, the experience was profoundly ambivalent. The republican in him recoiled at the naked tyranny, the reduction of men to pawns to be sacrificed. Yet the political analyst could not deny the terrifying efficiency of it all. In Borgia, he saw a figure who understood the core truths Machiavelli himself was piecing together. That fear is more reliable than love, that appearing virtuous is often more important than being so, and that a leader must be prepared to act with ferocious decisiveness to secure the state. Borgia was the fox and the lion incarnate. He became, in Machiavelli's mind, the archetype of the new prince, a living embodiment of the principles that would later fill the pages of his treatise. As he rode back to Florence in 1503, the image of Cesare Borgia, the cold gaze, the calculated smile, the absolute unflinching command, traveled with him. It was a dark mirror showing both the method of securing power and the profound human cost of its exercise. The diplomat had not just completed a mission. He had found his most potent case study. The memory of Cesare Borgia's efficient violence was a ghost that haunted Machiavelli's thoughts as he returned to a Florence perpetually on the brink. The city's reliance on fickle mercenaries and powerful foreign allies was a gaping wound in its sovereignty. He had seen the cold calculus in Louis XII's eyes, the transactional disdain for a republic without its own sword. The lesson of his diplomatic gaze crystallized into a single burning conviction. Florence must arm its own people. The idea of a citizen militia, drawn from the hardy peasants of the surrounding contado, became an obsession. It was more than a military reform. It was the tangible expression of his deepest republican ideal, that a state's true strength lay not in gold or foreign favor, but in the collective will and armed capability of its own citizens. He campaigned with a relentless, almost evangelical fervor. His memoranda to the Signoria were masterpieces of persuasive logic, stripped of ornament and heavy with dire precedent. He cited the ancient Roman Republic, whose legions of citizen soldiers had conquered the world, and the modern Swiss cantons, whose formidable pickmen were free men defending their own hearths. He contrasted these with the recent catastrophe at the Battle of Ravenna, where the hired condottieri had changed sides or fled, treating war as a commercial speculation rather than a matter of life and death. His arguments were cool, but the passion beneath them was white-hot. A state that paid others to fight for it, he insisted, was a state that had already surrendered its liberty. The militia was the necessary spine of a true republic. Opposition was immediate and fierce. The city's elite, the automati, recoiled at the proposal. Their distrust of the common people was an ancient, visceral reflex. To put weapons in the hands of peasants and artisans was to invite chaos, to risk the mob turning its pikes against the palazzi of the wealthy. They preferred the devil they knew. Professional captains whose loyalty could be bought, and whose armies could, in a pinch, be used to police the populace itself. The debates in the council chambers grew heated. Machiavelli, the middle-class functionary, found himself arguing against a wall of patrician disdain. He was accused of dangerous populism, of seeking to overturn the natural order. The fear he encountered was not of foreign invasion, but of domestic empowerment. Undaunted, he turned his bureaucratic skills to the meticulous work of creation. In late 1506, after years of advocacy, he finally received a limited commission. The victory was partial, but he seized it. He was appointed Chancellor of the newly formed Nine of the Militia, a committee tasked with the levies organization. He threw himself into the work with a joy that surpassed any diplomatic triumph. He traveled through the Tuscan countryside, from the rugged hills of the Mugello to the fertile valleys of the Arno, personally overseeing conscription. He assessed men not for their wealth or name, but for their robustness and loyalty to the Republic. He drafted statutes, designed uniforms of white waistcoats, red stockings and caps of white and red, the colors of Florence, and arranged for the procurement of pikes, swords, and a few arquebuses. The first official muster in the Piazza della Signoria was a moment of profound personal vindication. Ranks of countrymen, their faces rough but earnest, stood in ordered squares where once Savonarola's bonfires had burned. They were not the polished, perfumed soldiery of a French king, but they were their own. Machiavelli watched a rare, unguarded pride warming his usually cool demeanor. He addressed them not as a noble commander, but as a civil servant, speaking of duty to the common fatherland. This, he felt, was politics made flesh, the transformation of abstract civic virtue into a living, breathing force. The militia was his answer to the cynical realpolitik of Borgia and Lewis, a vision of power rooted in popular consent and collective defense. For a few brief years, the militia seemed to validate his every argument. It was deployed to the restive city of Pisa, which Florence had long struggled to reconquer. The citizen soldiers, fighting for a tangible idea of their state, displayed a tenacity that mercenaries lacked. In 1509, their persistent pressure contributed significantly to Pisa's surrender. The triumph was celebrated throughout Florence as a rebirth of native valor. Machiavelli stood at the zenith of his influence and fulfillment. The militia was his masterpiece, a proof of concept for his entire political philosophy. He had taken an idea born of observation and despair and forged it into steel and resolve. In the disciplined ranks of his peasants, he saw the future of a secure and sovereign republic, a fortress built not of stone, but of the armed will of its people. He could not yet imagine how fragile that fortress would prove, or how soon the very instrument of his pride would be shattered, dragging his world down with it. The success of the militia was the solid ground from which Machiavelli's influence soared. By 1506, he stood at the zenith of his practical power, a trusted architect of Florentine policy, whose counsel shaped the Republic's precarious dance for survival. The citizen soldiers were his tangible legacy, but his true arena remained the shadowed corridors of diplomacy, where the fate of states was decided by whispers, bluffs, and calculated betrayals. Italy had become a chessboard for voracious giants. The Kingdom of France, the Spanish crown, the Papal States under the warrior Pope Julius II. Florence, a wealthy but militarily weak republic, existed in the spaces between their clashing ambitions. Machiavelli's role was to ensure those spaces did not vanish entirely. He became a master of balance, a tightrope walker, suspended over an abyss, believing with every fiber of his being that his skill and insight could keep the Republic aloft. His days were a whirlwind of coded dispatches, urgent consultations, and strategic memoranda. From his office in the Palazzo della Signoria, He parsed intelligence from a network of agents and ambassadors. He tracked the movements of French troops in Lombardy, the gathering Spanish forces in Naples, and the unpredictable campaigns of Pope Julius, who dreamed of expelling the barbarians from Italy and restoring papal supremacy through sheer martial force. Each power viewed Florence as a tool or a trophy. Machiavelli's task was to convince each that the Republic was more valuable as a neutral or a subtly favoring friend. He crafted policies of exquisite ambiguity, promising just enough to the French to keep their protection, while offering sufficient diplomatic deference to the Pope to avoid excommunication, and sending reassuring signals to the Spanish to forestall their aggression. It was a triple game, requiring the precision of a watchmaker and the nerves of a gambler. He traveled incessantly as Florence's envoy, his mind a living ledger of shifting alliances. At the court of Emperor Maximilian I, he negotiated with haughty counselors who viewed Italian city-states as petty duchies. In the Vatican, he navigated the volatile temper of Julius II, a pope who wore armor beneath his vestments and whose rages were as strategic as his benedictions. Machiavelli observed the pontiff's furious energy, his ability to inspire troops and terrify cardinals, and filed the observation away. Here was another species of effective prince, one who blended sacred authority with profane force. He learned to read the subtle signs: a coldness in a formal greeting, an unusual delay in granting an audience, the careful phrasing of a communiqué as indicators of impending shifts in the political weather. He wrote his reports with crystalline clarity, stripping events of moralizing gloss to reveal the underlying mechanics of interest and fear. Back in Florence, he was no mere messenger but a key advisor. His voice carried weight in the councils of the Dieci and the Signoria. He argued for a foreign policy of agile realism, free from the sentimental attachments that had doomed other states. He urged his colleagues to think, not in terms of eternal friendships, but of contingent advantages. When Pope Julius formed the Holy League in 1511, allying with Spain and Venice against France, Machiavelli assessed the grim new calculus with cold eyes. Florence's traditional reliance on French support now threatened to isolate it from the Pope and the ascendant Spanish. With deft pressure, he helped steer the Republic toward a perilous neutrality, publicly maintaining ties with France while privately assuring the League of Florence's peaceful intentions. It was a dangerous straddle, but he believed it was the only way to preserve the Republic's liberty without being crushed in the giant's embrace. In these years, a quiet confidence, almost an arrogance, settled within him. He had seen the principles of power operate from the dungeons of Romagna to the throne rooms of Europe. He had written them, debated them, and now he was applying them. The militia was his proof that republican virtue could be martial. His diplomatic successes were proof that cunning could compensate for weakness. He watched lesser men, dogmatic idealists, timid aristocrats, greedy condottieri, fail because they misunderstood the game. He felt he had decoded it. The state was a mechanism, and he had learned its every gear and spring. The high wire he walked was not a path of chance, but of calculated equilibrium. Each step was measured, each adjustment precise. He believed with the certainty of a mathematician who has solved a profound theorem that he could navigate any storm, outmaneuver any foe, and keep his beloved Florence free. The coming catastrophe was not yet a shadow on his horizon. It was an impossibility, a failure of understanding that belonged to other men, in other, less perceptive times. He stood at the peak, the master of the game, and the view was clear. The catastrophe arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a rumor, carried by dust-choked couriers riding hard from the north. Prato, the name a mere 10 miles from Florence's gates, became a synonym for utter ruin. In late August 1512, a Spanish army serving the Holy League, furious at Florentine dithering and eager for plunder, fell upon the undefended town. The Florentine militia, Machiavelli's proud creation, was stationed elsewhere. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. For 3 weeks the Spanish troops sacked Prato with a brutality that seemed calculated to terrify all of Tuscany. Streets ran with blood. Churches were desecrated. Thousands were massacred. The news, dripping with horrific detail, flowed into Florence like a poison. The psychological effect was instantaneous and total. The Republic's confidence, already frayed by diplomatic isolation, shattered. In the Palazzo della Signoria, a cold paralysis set in. The debates that had once buzzed with Machiavelli's strategic calculations were replaced by a stunned silence, then by a frantic, fearful scramble for survival. The Spanish army, its bloodlust sated, but its political mission clear, turned its gaze toward Florence. There would be no siege, no heroic last stand. The city's leaders, staring at the ghastly example of Prato, understood the implicit ultimatum. The Medici family, exiled since 1494, and now backed by papal authority and Spanish lances, waited just beyond the horizon. Their return was the price for sparing Florence a similar fate. The Republic, born of Savonarolan fervor, and sustained by 18 years of precarious maneuvering, consented to its own euthanasia. The institutions of popular government voted themselves out of existence. The great bell of the Palazzo, the Vacca, remained silent. The collapse was not a defeat. It was a surrender, quiet and complete. For Niccolo Machiavelli, the world inverted in a single day. One moment he was the indispensable secretary, the architect of policy, his desk a nexus of state intelligence. The next he was a man standing in a suddenly empty office. The official notice was curt, devoid of reason or ceremony. By order of the restored Medici authorities, he was dismissed from his posts as second chancellor and secretary to the 9 of the militia. All his commissions, his authority, his hard-won influence were nullified. He was ordered to vacate the Palazzo della Signoria immediately and forbidden from setting foot in it again. A further decree confined him to Florentine territory, cutting him off from the diplomatic world that had been his second home. They did not arrest him. They did not need to. They simply erased him from the machinery of state, rendering him a ghost in his own city. He walked out of the palace gates for the last time, the September sun feeling strangely cold. The piazza was eerily normal. Merchants hawked their wares. Citizens gossiped, but the air vibrated with a new, uneasy tension. Medici partisans, long suppressed, began to appear with tentative smiles. The high wire had snapped, and the fall was not into an abyss of violence, but into a void of irrelevance. His life's work, the militia, the preservation of the Republic, lay in ruins. The militia itself, the embodiment of his republican ideal, was disbanded by the new regime, its weapons confiscated, its soldiers sent home. The force designed to ensure Florence would never again kneel to foreign arms had been rendered moot by those very arms, its existence a bitter irony. He returned to his modest house near the Ponte Vecchio, a space that now felt like a cage. The books and papers that had once been tools of statecraft were just objects, the calculated realism he had mastered, the principles he believed could shield a state from fortune, had proven catastrophically insufficient against the raw, uncomplicated force of a Spanish army unleashed with papal blessing. He had spent years analyzing the moves of lions and foxes, only to be trampled by a wolf pack that obeyed no rules but its own appetite. The Medici were back, not through cunning or popular appeal, but because a foreign power had willed it. It was a lesson in political physics more brutal than any he had ever codified. When the calculus of power tilts overwhelmingly toward sheer overwhelming force, all diplomacy, all civic virtue, all clever balancing becomes mere noise. He was 43 years old. His career was over, and the state he had served no longer existed. He was a man banished to the sidelines of history, ordered to watch in silence as the world he knew was dismantled. The only thing left to him was thought, and in the deepening silence of his exile those thoughts began to coil dark and defiant, seeking a new form of power born of absolute powerlessness. The confinement was a slow torture of its own. For months, Niccolò Machiavelli lived in a state of suspended animation within Florence's walls, a ghost haunting his own past. He tended to minor family business, corresponded with old friends in veiled terms, and waited. The new Medici regime, led by Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici and his brother Giuliano, moved with cautious grace, offering pardons to some Republicans while watching others with hawk's eyes. Machiavelli, the former architect of the fallen state, was a name on a list, neither important enough to court nor insignificant enough to forget. He existed in a gray zone of suspicion, hoping his obscurity would be his shield. It was a fragile hope, and in the tense spring of 1513, it shattered. The conspiracy was amateurish, born of nostalgic fervor rather than cold calculation. A group of young Republicans, led by Agostino Caponi and Pietro Paolo Boscoli, plotted to assassinate Giuliano de' Medici. Their plans were loose, their circle porous. The plot was discovered before any action could be taken. The would-be tyrannicides dragged from their beds. Under torture, names were spoken, connections suggested. Machiavelli's was among them. His association with Boscoli, tenuous and largely social, was enough. In the pre-dawn darkness of February 7th, the Bargello's guards hammered on his door. There was no ceremony, no charge read aloud. He was taken, a man of 44, into the cold embrace of the stingy. The cell was the physical manifestation of his political death. It was a narrow, reeking space, its walls sweating with damp, its air thick with the memory of screams. Here, the abstract forces he had dissected, fear, power, necessity, became immediate and visceral. The interrogators were not interested in philosophical discourse. They wanted names, networks, confessions of intent. Machiavelli denied everything. He was a Republican by conviction, but not a conspirator by action. His denials were met with the logic of the rope, the strappado, his wrists bound behind his back, the rope thrown over a beam, his body lifted and then dropped, the sudden jerk transmitting its violent physics through his shoulders. The first fall was a white-hot explosion of agony, a revelation of the body's limits. The second dislocated something, a sickening pop swallowed by his own choked cry. The third, the fourth. The pain ceased to be a series of events and became a state of being, a country in which he now resided. He endured 6 drops. 6 times his world narrowed to the screaming tendons, the grating bones, the desperate gasp for air that followed. He confessed to nothing. He offered no names, implicated no friends. He clung to the truth of his innocence, but more than that, he clung to a core of self that even this machinery could not erase. Between sessions dumped on the filthy straw, he practiced a grim mental algebra. He calculated the angles of his shoulders, the tolerance of sinew, the odds of permanent maiming versus death. He thought of Cesare Borgia's cold efficiency, of the instrumental use of cruelty he had once analyzed from a safe distance. Now he was its object. The theory was made flesh, and the flesh was breaking. Power was not a treatise. It was a pulley and a rope, a jailer's bored expression, the absolute certainty that your body could be made to betray you. The experience stripped him of his final illusions. The republic he had served was a beautiful, abstract idea. The statecraft he had mastered was an elegant game. This, the crude, physical reduction of a man to a broken animal, was the foundation upon which all of it ultimately rested. The lion's share of power was not cunning but violence, held in reserve, but always present. He saw it with terrifying clarity in the darkness. Princes ruled because they could do this, and subjects obeyed because they feared it. His own life's work, his memoranda on militia, his diplomatic ballets, were the intricate scrollwork on a door that could be kicked in by any thug with a mandate. The realization was not despair, but a cold, clear awakening. It hollowed him out, miraculously, or perhaps because his guilt was as insubstantial as his captors gradually concluded. The torture stopped. A general amnesty was declared for the Medici's ascension to the papacy as Leo X. In March, battered and diminished, Machiavelli was released. He walked out of the stingy gates into a sunlight that felt alien, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, every step a reminder of the abyss he had inhabited. He was not just a dismissed official now, he was a broken man, his body, a testament to his powerlessness, his spirit scoured clean of any lingering romanticism about the nature of rule. The sentence was exile, not beyond the Alps, but to the confines of his small, run-down farm at Sant'Andrea in Percasina, a few miles south of the city. It was a double banishment, from Florence's political heart, and from the version of himself that had believed he could shape its destiny. He gathered his few possessions, kissed his wife Marietta and his children, and took the road out of the city. As the walls of Florence receded behind him, he carried only the scars on his body and the crystalline, terrible knowledge in his mind. The game was over. The player was broken. But the observer, hardened in the fire of the strappado, remained. And in the quiet of the countryside, that observer began to write. The farm at Sant'Andrea was a world of small, relentless necessities. The days began before dawn, measured not by council bells, but by the crowing of a rooster and the lowing of the oxen. Machiavelli would pull on coarse, mud-stained clothes and step out into the chill air, his shoulders still aching with the deep, remembered violence of the rope, protesting as he lifted tools or bargained with local woodcutters over a load of timber. He discussed the price of grain with the dullard farmers at the tavern, played cricket on a greasy tabletop for petty stakes, and trudged behind a plow, his hands once skilled with a quill, now growing calloused and rough. This was his life now, a pantomime of rustic triviality, a performance of irrelevance for any Medici informant who might be watching. By day he was a harmless, defeated landowner swallowed by the petty economics of survival. But night was his own. After a meager supper, He would retreat to his small, sparsely furnished study, shutting the door on the silent Tuscan hills. He would exchange his workman's tunic for the formal robes of his old office, the fine, worn velvet a ghostly uniform. He would light a single candle, its flame carving a small island of light from the darkness. Then he would sit, dip his quill, and begin to write. The transformation was absolute. The man who had bargained for firewood vanished, and in his place sat the analyst, the dissector, the furious intellect. The pain in his shoulders became a focal point, a bodily reminder of the truths he now pursued with a feverish, almost vengeful clarity. He was not composing a treatise. He was conducting an autopsy on the power that had broken him, decoding its mechanics from the inside out. The pages filled with a cold, relentless logic. He addressed his work to Lorenzo de' Medici, the young Duke of Urbino, framing it as a gift, a manual for a new prince. The dedication was a masterpiece of desperate artifice, a bid for relevance from the political grave. But the text itself was something far more personal. Each chapter was a forensic analysis of his own ruin. When he wrote that a prince must be both fox and lion, he saw himself, the clever diplomat who had lacked the force to defend his republic. When he argued that it is better to be feared than loved, he felt the terror of the strappado, and recalled the fickle Florentine crowds who had abandoned Savonarola, the cold calculus of Cesare Borgia's treachery, at Senigallia the dispassionate self-interest of Louis XII, the brutal efficacy of the Spanish sack of Prato. All were dissected, stripped of moral context, and presented as operational principles. He wrote not with the anger of a victim, but with the chilling detachment of a scientist examining a deadly virus under glass. His own suffering was merely data, the most compelling proof of his theorems. The contrast between his days and nights was the essence of his defiance. By day he was powerless, subject to the whims of weather and market. By night, in the realm of thought, he wielded absolute authority. He reconstructed the world that had cast him out, reducing its chaotic violence to elegant, immutable laws. He granted himself in prose the power he had never possessed in life, the power to instruct princes, to explain the very forces that had crushed him. It was an act of intellectual alchemy, transforming the lead of his humiliation and pain into a guide to supreme command. The candle would gutter low, the hills outside still and dark, as he filled page after page, building a monument of understanding from the rubble of his career. The exile in his silent study was not pleading for a return to the game. He was rewriting its rules, ensuring that even in his obscurity his voice, clear, cold, and unforgiving, would echo in the chambers of power. Long after his body had returned to the Tuscan soil he now pretended to tend. The manuscript for the prince was completed, a compact, dangerous thing. Machiavelli sent it into the world with a hopeful dedication, but no summons came from the Medici court. The silence from Florence was absolute. The treatise, born of nocturnal defiance, changed nothing in his daily reality. He remained on his farm, a ghost. Yet the very act of writing had unlocked a torrent. The cold analyst of power discovered he had more to say, and it flowed in a different, deeper channel. Turning from the mirror of princely rule, he faced the sunlit ideal of the Republic. He pulled his worn copy of Livy's History of Rome from the shelf, its pages a gateway to the ancient world he had always revered. Here, in the sat, daylight hours stolen from rustic chores, he began his discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livius, This was not a manual for a single ruler, but a blueprint for a free state, the full expression of the civic faith that had animated his life's work before the disaster. The contrast was profound, yet to him it was no contradiction. The prince had examined how to seize and hold power in a corrupt world. The discourses explored how to cultivate a virtuous citizenry to make seizure unnecessary. His pen moved from the ruthless pragmatism of Borgia to the noble checks and balances of the Roman Republic. He wrote of mixed constitutions, the vital tension between the nobility and the common people, and the necessity of public accusation as a safety valve for discontent. He argued that a state's true greatness sprang not from the genius of one man, but from the collective liberty of its citizens, whose fierce love for their own laws made them formidable in war and just in peace. His militia, that shattered dream, lived again in these pages as theory. The work was a love letter to the Florence that had spurned him, a testament to the ideals he had served and lost. The theorist of cold power was, at heart, a passionate republican, and in the solitude of Sant'Andrea, he gave that passion its most eloquent form. Simultaneously, a third voice emerged, sharp and satirical, perhaps as a release from the dense political reasoning, or perhaps to dissect the corruption he saw with a different tool. He began drafting a play. La Mandragola was a comedy, a farce set in contemporary Florence. Its plot revolved around lust, deception, and the cynical manipulation of a foolish husband, a lovesick youth, a corrupt friar, and a venal lawyer. Every character was out for their own advantage, cloaking their greed in respectability. The friar in particular, with his ready rationalizations for sin in exchange for donations, was a savage caricature of the clerical hypocrisy Machiavelli had observed for decades. The play was uproariously funny and bitterly dark, a portrait of a society where all virtue was performative, and every institution was for sale. It completed a triptych of his intellect: the cold realist of the prince, the ardent republican of the discourses, and the sharp-eyed social critic of the stage, all the same man viewing the human animal from different angles. His main connection to the world he analyzed was his correspondence, particularly with his friend Francesco Vittori, the Florentine ambassador in Rome. Their letters were a lifeline, a secret republic of two. He described his rustic existence with self-deprecating humor, trapping thrushes, arguing with millers, before pivoting to incisive commentary on the latest political news Vittori supplied: the maneuvers of Pope Leo X, the campaigns of the French and Spanish, the endless Italian tragedy. He was a ghost at the feast, analyzing the banquet from a distance, his insights no less acute for being ignored. In these letters, the three facets of his exile, the scholar, the republican, the satirist, fused into a coherent, tragicomic voice. He was both participant in and observer of his own irrelevance, a mind of formidable power, reduced to commenting on events it could no longer influence. The years from 1514 to 1517 passed in this rhythm of fertile isolation. By day he was the farmer, tending his meager vines and olives. In the study by candlelight he was a citizen of Rome and a critic of Florence, building intellectual monuments to liberty while crafting a comedy that laid bare its absence. The works were his true militia now, legions of ideas marching forth from his desk. They were his defense against oblivion, his proof that though his body was confined and his career dead, his perception was undimmed, perhaps even sharpened by defeat. He had been stripped of everything but his mind, and with that mind he was constructing a legacy that would outlast the princes who ignored him and the republic that had failed. The exile's study was not a prison cell, but a forge, and within it he was hammering his experience into a body of work that was itself a final, intricate, and profoundly defiant act of statecraft. The manuscript of the prince traveled through trusted hands, a secret too potent to be confined to a desk. Copies were made, passed among humanist scholars and disaffected Republicans in Florence, then beyond the Alps. It generated a low, buzzing shock, a mixture of horror and admiration. Some decried its coldness as a work of the devil. Others recognized its terrifying clarity as a work of genius. But in the one place that mattered, the Medici court, it was met with a silence as profound as the tomb. No acknowledgment came from Lorenzo di Accated. No summons arrived from Rome, where Pope Leo X and his cousin Cardinal Giulio de' Medici governed the family's interests. The gift, crafted with such desperate hope and intellectual defiance, was ignored. It was as if Machiavelli had shouted a devastating truth into a gale. The wind swallowed the sound and carried on. He remained at Sant'Andrea, his exile now calcifying into permanence. Florence was a mere 7 miles away, but it might as well have been across an ocean. He visited occasionally on permitted business, walking streets that felt both familiar and alien. The city had adapted to Medici rule with the pragmatic ease of a plant bending toward the sun. Old Republicans eyed him with suspicion, seeing a man tainted by his audacious treatise and his rumored attempts to ingratiate himself with the rulers. Medici partisans viewed him with equal distrust, remembering his long service to the fallen state and the unsettling, immoral wisdom of his book. He was a man without a faction, an analyst without a patron, viewed as either a dangerous cynic or a pathetic opportunist by all sides. In the political calculus of Florence, his value was precisely 0. The only currency he had left was his pen. In 1520, a minor commission finally came, a bone tossed to a persistent dog. The University of Florence, through the mediation of a friendly cardinal, asked him to write a history of the city. It was a scholarly exercise, devoid of real power, but it was work. He accepted with a mixture of gratitude and bitter irony. The man who had dissected the engine of power was now asked to chronicle its exhaust. He buried himself in the archives of the Orsolari Gardens, a meeting place for intellectuals, his fingers tracing the parchment records of Florentine folly and glory. The Florentine histories became his new nightly labor. He wrote with elegance and insight, tracing the city's internal divisions and external wars, but the project felt like an epitaph for his own ambitions. He was memorializing the very political chaos he had once sought to master. The deepest sting, however, was watching his insights being adopted by others while he languished in obscurity. In letters from friends and rumors from court, he heard of young secretaries and ambitious condottieri citing maxims that felt like his own children, kidnapped and raised in foreign houses. A papal legist would argue for the swift, decisive use of cruelty to quell a rebellion. A French diplomat would coolly assess an alliance purely in terms of advantage, dismissing ancient ties as sentimental baggage. They used the tools, but they did not speak the craftsman's name. His ideas, born of torture and exile, were seeping into the groundwater of European statecraft, becoming part of the unspoken grammar of power. He was the prophet without honor, not just in his own country, but in his own intellectual domain. His legacy was being written by other hands, anonymously. He would sit in the Orsolari Gardens after a day of research, listening to the debates of younger men. They spoke of reason of state, of necessity overriding law, with a fashionable detachment that made his blood run cold. They had not felt the rope, had not seen Prato burn, had not been erased by a decree. They played with the fire he had been burned by, treating his hard-won truths as clever paradoxes for salon discussion. The bitterness was a dry taste in his mouth. He had aimed to be a physician to the state, diagnosing its ills with unflinching honesty. Instead, he had become an apothecary, his formulas used by others while he was barred from the sickroom. The final crushing irony was that his work, intended to restore him to relevance, had only cemented his exile. By explaining power so perfectly, he had made himself seem too dangerous to employ and too acute to ignore, thus condemning himself to the shadows. He walked back to his farm as the sun set, a silhouette against the Tuscan hills, carrying the weight of understanding that had granted him everything except the one thing he wanted: a part to play in the living story of power. The wheel of fortune, which Machiavelli had so often described as the arbiter of human affairs, gave a faint, tantalizing turn. By 1525, the Medici position in Florence, and indeed in all Italy, was under threat once more. The imperial forces of Charles V, having defeated the French at Pavia, cast a long shadow over the peninsula. Pope Clement VII, the former Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, vacillated in his alliances, and Florence grew restless under a rule that seemed both weak and foreign. In this atmosphere of renewed crisis, Machiavelli saw a final slender opening. His Florentine histories were complete. The work was a masterful narrative, tracing the city's strife with a tragic clarity that only a disillusioned patriot could muster. He decided to present it in person to the Pope, who was residing at the Papal Palace in Rome. It was not just the delivery of a manuscript, it was the deployment of his last remaining asset, his intellect, in one final bid for rehabilitation. The journey to Rome was a pilgrimage through his own past. He passed landscapes he had traversed as a confident envoy, now viewing them through the eyes of a supplicant. The papal court, when he gained entry, was a whirl of anxiety and grandeur. Clement VII, a shrewd but indecisive man, received him with polite detachment. Machiavelli presented the elegantly bound histories, speaking not as a historian but as a strategist. He used the lessons of the past, so meticulously chronicled in the pages, to frame urgent proposals for the present. He spoke of military reform, of the desperate need to fortify Florence against the storm he saw gathering. He argued for a return to the principle of a citizen levy, updated and expanded, and for the immediate strengthening of the city's walls and the fortification of strategic points in the territory. His voice, though older, carried the same compelling logic that had once swayed Republican councils. For a moment, watching the Pope's thoughtful expression, he allowed himself to hope. The ideas that had been ignored for a decade seemed to find purchase in the fertile soil of fear. A token was offered. Perhaps impressed by the histories, or perhaps valuing the old fox's experience in a time of looming war, Clement granted him a minor commission. Machiavelli was appointed to a committee overseeing Florence's fortifications, reporting to the city's Medici-appointed governors. It was a pale shadow of his former authority, a consultant's role devoid of executive power, but it was a foot in the door of the Palazzo della Signoria. A crack in the wall of his exile, he returned to Florence not as a restored statesman, but as a specialized clerk. Yet to a man who had been a ghost for so long, even this felt like a resurrection. He walked the ramparts with surveyors, examined crumbling masonry and drafted memos on defensive angles and the placement of artillery. The work was mundane, but its purpose thrilled him: to make Florence impregnable, to finally apply his theories in the concrete and stone of survival. The moment of hope was tragically brief. His advice, delivered in detailed reports, was received with bureaucratic inertia and polite disregard. The Medici officials, more concerned with courtly politics and papal favor than with military preparedness, viewed his urgent recommendations as expensive, alarmist fantasies. Proposals for conscription were dismissed as dangerously populist. Plans for new bastions were deferred due to cost. He was heard but not heeded. He watched in mounting frustration as committees debated and funds were diverted. While the imperial clouds darkened in the other north, he was repeating the very pattern that had doomed the republic he served. The failure of those in power to recognize necessity until it was too late. The cruel joke was that he was now witnessing it from within, the apparatus of power, yet remained as powerless as ever to change its course. His role was not a rehabilitation, but a cruel pantomime of utility, designed to flatter his ego while ignoring his counsel. By early 1527, the crisis was imminent. Imperial troops under the Constable de Bourbon were marching south, unpaid and hungry, toward Rome itself. Florence, weakly defended and politically divided, lay in their potential path. Machiavelli's last memos took on a desperate tone, his prose stripped of all scholarly ornament, screaming the simple arithmetic of siege and storm. They vanished into the administrative void. The final bitter realization settled upon him as he stood on the walls, one gray afternoon, looking out at the Tuscan hills. He had been given a chance to fortify the city against the very fate he had always predicted, and the city, through its rulers, had refused. His last gamble had not failed. It had been rendered meaningless by the very human short-sightedness he had spent his life document. He was not just an exile from power, but a prophet condemned to watch his prophecies fulfilled. His hands still empty, his voice still just a whisper in the wind that now carried the distant drumbeat of approaching armies. The storm broke not over Florence, but over Rome. In May of 1527, the mutinous, unpaid imperial army smashed through the feeble defenses of the Eternal City. The sack of Rome was an orgy of violence that shocked Christendom, a desecration that seemed to mark the end of an era. Pope Clement VII of Medici became a prisoner in Castel Sant'Angelo. In Florence, the news acted like a lightning strike on dry tinder. The Medici regime, its papal spine shattered, collapsed within days. The citizens, long simmering with resentment, rose. The Medici were expelled once more, not by foreign arms this time, but by their own people. The great bell of the Palazzo della Dia Signoria rang out, a sound not heard for 15 years. The Republic was restored. For Niccolò Machiavelli, watching from his farm, the moment was one of profound, dizzying contradiction. The system he loved, the object of his deepest political faith, had been resurrected. The city he had served and analyzed was free again. He should have been exultant. He was not. A cold apprehension settled in his gut. He knew the new men forming the government, ardent, pious republicans, who had kept the faith during the Medici interval. They remembered him not as the loyal secretary of the First Republic, but as the author of The Prince, as the man who had, however futilely, offered his services to the Medici, who had accepted their token commission. In their eyes he was tainted, a compromised figure, a theorist of amoral power, who had flirted with the enemy. He presented himself anyway, driven by a hope that felt like a last frail ghost. He offered his counsel, his experience, his unwavering belief in a citizen militia, the very cause of his life. The rejection was polite, final, and utterly devastating. The new republic wanted no part of him. His name was associated with cynicism, with a dangerous, godless realism that had no place in their purified state. The system he had dissected, loved, and sought to save now spurned him with the clean, cruel efficiency of a surgeon excising a tumor. The irony was perfect, absolute, and unbearable. He had survived the Medici's torture and their indifference, only to be deemed unworthy by the very republic whose principles he had championed in his exile study. He returned to Sant'Andrea. The rejection was a mortal blow. A deep despondency, heavier than any he had known, settled upon him. The last bridge to the world of action had been burned. He took to his bed, a sickness of the spirit becoming a sickness of the body. Friends who visited found him listless, his famed vitality extinguished. The fierce intellect was now turned inward, contemplating the final, unanswerable joke of his life. He had written the book on power, and it had made him powerless. He had diagnosed the illness of states, and was denied a role in the cure. He had loved Florence with a patriot's fervor, and Florence in all its incarnations had ultimately found him wanting. He died on June 21st, 1527, just weeks after the Republic's restoration. The cause was recorded as a stomach ailment. But those who knew him understood the truth. He had been killed by the final, exquisite twist of fortune. The man who had analyzed the brutal game of politics with unmatched clarity had been defeated, not by a prince's cruelty, but by his own republic's purity. In a quiet ceremony, he was buried in the Franciscan church of Santa Croce, his tomb unmarked. The republic he had yearned for marched on without him, already beginning the process of forgetting the uncomfortable prophet in its midst. The curtain fell on a life lived in the tense space between thought and action, a life whose greatest legacy, a cold, brilliant light cast on the mechanics of power, would only begin to illuminate the world after the man himself had vanished into the Florentine earth, his name detached from the man, becoming a fluid, dark adjective in the languages of Europe, Machiavellian. It slid into political discourse and popular imagination, a byword for cunning, deceit, and amoral statecraft. The nuance of his thought, the delicate balance he observed between necessity and virtue, his profound love for republican liberty, his despair at corruption, was stripped away, leaving only the stark, terrifying silhouette of the prince he described. He became a caricature, a philosophical villain, his name invoked to condemn any act of realpolitik, any unsentimental calculation. The shadow prince eclipsed the real man, the patriot who had built a militia, the scholar who revered Livy, the exile who wrote comedies to stave off despair. His works, circulated in manuscript and then in print, traveled under a cloak of scandal and fascination. Monarchs read the prince in secret, admiring its clarity while publicly decrying its author. Reformers and revolutionaries would later mine the discourses for arguments against tyranny, even as they shunned the association with his tainted name. His insights seeped into the foundations of modern political science, but often uncredited. His conclusions absorbed while his premises were condemned. He was the forbidden teacher, the one who told the secrets of the guild, and for that, he was exiled from the respectable pantheon of philosophy. His legacy was a paradox. universally influential, officially reviled. The haunting question lingered, a ghost in the archives where his letters lay. Was Niccolò Machiavelli destroyed because he failed to practice what he preached? He had analyzed the lion and the fox, yet when the crisis came, he possessed neither the force to defend his republic nor the cunning to save his career. He was a brilliant diagnostician who could not cure his own patient, master of theory, broken by practice. Or was his ruin precisely because he understood the brutal game better than anyone? His vision was too clear, his conclusions too unsettling. He removed the comforting veils of divine right and moral virtue to reveal the engine of fear and interest underneath. Such knowledge is dangerous to those in power, for it demystifies their authority, and fatal to those out of power, for it renders them transparent. He was feared not for his treachery, but for his terrible clarity. In the end, perhaps both were true. He was the prisoner of his own insight, trapped between the world as it was and the world as he believed it could be. He dissected power with the dispassion of an anatomist, yet he never ceased to yearn for a republic where such dissections would be unnecessary. That tension between the realist and the idealist, the analyst and the patriot, was the core of his tragedy and his genius. He remains a shadow, not because he was evil, but because he forced us to look at the shadows within our institutions and ourselves. The final irony is that the man who sought so desperately to be useful in life achieved a form of immortality as a symbol of political ruthlessness, his complex humanity forever simplified into a single chilling word. The Shadow Prince endures, a perpetual question mark on the nature of power, while the Florentine exile, in all his contradictory passion, fades into the historical twilight from which he observed us all.